Hello, Aggies and friends of UC Davis. I'm Chancellor Gary May, and I thank you for joining us today for our Plugged In event series. We're hosting these virtual events for valued friends of the university so we can stay connected and share the tremendous things that are happening at UC Davis. We've said many times before that UC Davis takes on the most pressing challenges of our time. This is not lip service or some marketing tagline. This is real. And now, more than ever, we are proving this. The speakers you're about to hear from are a perfect example of how UC Davis is taking these challenges head on. As supporters of our university, you play an essential role in moving this work forward and ensuring that our students can stay on the path to success. We hope you enjoy today's program. It will give you an insider's look into innovations at UC Davis that are positively impacting the lives of people, animals, and the environment. Thank you for your support of UC Davis and all we do to make our world a better place.
Hello, welcome. Good afternoon. My name is Molly Cohen-D'Agostino, and I'm the Policy Director of UC Davis Three Revolutions Future Mobility Program. For those of you unfamiliar with the Three Revolutions, we are a unique research program focused on three tides of change in transportation. The first is vehicle sharing, electrification, and the last is increased automation. This program was started at the Institute of Transportation Studies here at UC Davis, and the mission is both to advance research and public policy related to these intersecting revolutions. So we're pleased to bring these revolutions to the Plugged In event series and to provide all of you, supporters of UC Davis, with an insider's look into some of the innovative and groundbreaking things happening here at UC Davis. So with that in mind, it's my pleasure to introduce you to the person who conceived of the Three Revolutions concept, the fearless leader of the Institute of Transportation Studies, Director Dan Sperling. Dr. Sperling is the founding director of the Institute of Transportation Studies, now with 200 plus faculty, researchers, and staff focusing on how to make transportation better. This institute works closely with industry, government, community groups, and NGOs, and provides research that is directly relevant to industry and government. So for the past 13 years, Professor Sperling, Director Sperling, has also served on the California Air Resources Board, which oversees major air pollution and climate policies in California. He's also won numerous awards, including the Blue Planet Prize in 2013, for being a pioneer in opening up new fields of study to create more efficient, low carbon, and environmentally beneficial transportation systems. So today he's going to give you an exclusive look into how transportation innovation can radically change the course of our economy and our environment. Then we're going to turn the program over to you and allow you to ask questions of Dr. Sperling. We've received a ton of great questions in advance from attendees and who've already submitted questions. So we'll go through some of those, and some also can be submitted in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So go ahead and submit questions while we go through the presentation and our questions. And for those whose questions don't get answered, we will provide some resources that might address unanswered questions. And so we'll also take a short poll after the Q&A, we'd love for you to take that poll so we can be sure to incorporate your feedback into future events. And now, please join me in welcoming ITS Davis Director Dan Sperling.
Thank you, Molly. Thank you so much. This really is a great pleasure and great honor for me. I've been at UC Davis many years. You know, when I started out, I was in the Peace Corps a couple years as a planner, worked for EPA, US EPA a couple years. I always thought I'd be moving around in different jobs and professions, but I've been at UC Davis ever since I finished my PhD. And UC Davis has treated me so well. It's the best decision other than marrying my wife that I've made in my lifetime. And it's really been a wonderful place because it's, you know, as Molly was just starting to hint at, I've been what some people call a serial academic entrepreneur. I've started up many centers and institutes and graduate programs at Davis. You know, the biggest and the one I'm still heading is the Institute of Transportation Studies. But the university has allowed me, encouraged me, supported me in all of this, and especially encouraged me and rewarded me for being more than just a straight academic, for building programs, where we reach out, we try to have an impact, we try to bring science to policy, make the world a better place. And so it's been a great experience. So since the beginning, I've focused on sustainable transportation. And by the way, you went through that role there where all the great programs at UC Davis, but our transportation program is generally acknowledged as the leading program in the country on sustainable transportation, perhaps even in the world. We are the home of the National Center on Sustainable Transportation, funded by the US Department of Transportation and a variety of other agencies. And so that's what I've focused on my whole career, sustainable transportation. How do we make transportation more sustainable in an economic sense, in an environmental sense, and in a social sense, social equity sense? So we've, if I look back just a little bit on transportation, we, the broad we, have created this amazing transportation system in the US over the past 100 years, and it's built around the car. And in fact, Los Angeles is really where it all started. Los Angeles is the model. It's the template that the whole rest of the world followed in terms of car-centric urban development, car-centric transportation. And in many ways, it was very successful. But what I'm going to assert here is that it's been too successful. It's gone too far. And we've created transportation, we've built our cities, our lifestyles around the car to an extent that it's really starting to have a lot of disadvantages. And so, I would just, before I move into, thinking more positively about all of this, we can look at our car-centric transportation system and see how extraordinarily expensive it is. So when I say sustainable, again, I mean in an environmental, economic, and equity sense. So from an economic perspective, we pay about $8,500 per year for every car we own and operate. And that's including depreciation, insurance, gasoline, parking, and so on. And even for used cars, that's for relatively new cars, even for used cars that are operated 10 or 15,000 miles a year, which is average, the cost approaches that. It's really a very heavy cost for us as users. It's a heavy cost for government, building all those roads and all that parking structures and parking spaces. It's also environmentally, it's been very expensive. Transportation in California, transportation accounts for almost half of all the greenhouse gases that are emitted. It accounts for almost half of all the air pollution in California. And so the environmental hit has been large, and then if you look at it from an equity perspective, the car serves many people very well, but it marginalizes a large part of our population. Those people that are physically disabled, those people that don't have as much income, they can't afford it. Either they don't have access to it or they can't afford it. Even if you have a car, a relatively low income household has a car, it's often not reliable. People have to share it. So it's really, we've created a very costly, resource intensive, expensive transportation system. So what do we do about this? Well, in the past half century, and one might even argue almost a full century, there's been very little system innovation in transportation. Our cars are functionally the same as they've been for many, many decades. 4 wheels, same speed, same carrying capacity. And if you look at the roads, the road design is basically same. Transit, basically same design for our buses and our rail in terms of how it functions. But here we are, starting about 10 years ago, all kinds of new innovations started sweeping through transportation. And so after this long period of very little innovation where The institutions got kind of stuck. The technology got kind of stuck. I mean, yes, people might say, the cars are a little bit safer. Cars are safer. They're more comfortable, but in a functional sense, they've not evolved very much. And so now here we are, about 10 years ago, electrification, electric vehicles started to gain popularity. That was with the Tesla in particular, but General Motors with its Volt plug-in hybrid, with Nissan and its Leaf. It really started a revolution in how our vehicles are propelled. And these electric vehicles are important because it means much greater efficiency, much less pollution, much less greenhouse gases. And then we've seen tremendous innovation in this concept of sharing of rides and vehicles. And that also, even though Lyft and Uber seem like they're just commonplace, and at least until a few months ago, such a common part of our life for many of us, really didn't get started until after 2010. And so they've only been around for a decade. And who would have thought that we'd be willing to get in a stranger's car, that we'd have an app, we just press a button, a vehicle comes and picks us up, takes us where we want to go. And so that's been really, it is being revolutionary. And the third revolution is automation of vehicles. So that's been a little slower to happen, although in fact there's a lot of automation that is going into our cars, but not to the point of where it's basically a robot car yet. Although I've gone through a whole series of cars myself. I had 2 generations of Prius, had a Nissan Leaf. I did operate, have access to a GM Volt for a few months. And then I had a hydrogen car, hydrogen fuel cell car, and a Tesla. And there was a year in there that I didn't have access to any car. My wife was spending a lot of time in Southern California. And so I just gave up my hydrogen car and I depended on my favorite zero emission vehicle, my bicycle. Very Davis. That's what my wife says about, living in Davis. It's like a cult, but it's a good cult. So here we are, we've got these 3 revolutions, and I would argue that they provide the best opportunity we have to create sustainable transportation. And by far. So with electric vehicles, it's pretty obvious that we have the potential to get down to 0 carbon if the electricity is made in a renewable way, which increasingly is happening. Then the car has very little greenhouse gas impact, no local air pollution. But it's the sharing and automation that's perhaps more controversial, but in many ways so important. And that is that while there's been a lot of hype for automation, for instance, but there is a lot of hype, but consider that Tesla that I drive. I love it when I get in that car and I turn on that autopilot, and when I'm on I-5 or on a freeway and I can relax, it's much more pleasant driving. Yes, I pay attention to the road. Yes, I hold on to the wheel, but it really is much more comfortable driving. And I think the data is showing much safer as well. But where we really get the benefit is when we get to the future, and we don't know quite yet how far that future is, but there's a future in which we have these automated cars and the technology is almost there where we can be able to just call a vehicle, comes and takes us where we go. Now, if that automated car has multiple people in it, and part of public policy is creating the incentives that we do share rides in these vehicles, then we will greatly reduce the cost of travel. We will make it much more accessible to disadvantaged travelers, both physically disabled as well as economically disadvantaged. And we really address, I think it's by far the best opportunity to address the social equity challenges and problems that we face in transportation. So I've become a policy wonk, and perhaps I'll talk a little bit about my role with the California Air Resources Board that I joined 12 or 13 years ago. But it's really reinforced for me the need, the obligation, indeed, the responsibility for us in academia to make a much greater effort to bring science to policy. And that's what the Institute of Transportation Studies does and a number of other centers that I'm working with. We're really creating a culture, we're creating a reward systems, and we're creating processes to assure that the research we do will have an impact. And we have a long ways to go yet, but I would argue that we, certainly our transportation energy groups, but many parts of UC Davis are way ahead of other universities in having this commitment. It goes back to that land grant mission. And I think UC Davis really embraces it, and I certainly do. And that mission is to pursue the public interest. And so with these innovations aren't guaranteed to turn out well the way I described it. I'm an optimist. So I like to weave out these positive narratives and to do the research that will support it. But the reality is, if those automated cars are owned by individuals, if these ride-hailing companies only carry one passenger, what we see is a great increase in vehicle use and therefore increase in greenhouse gases, increase in pollution, more demand for parking spaces, more demand for road space. And so there's a very, very important critical role for policy is to direct these innovations toward the public interest. So let me just make a couple comments more. And that is that this work, the three revolutions, and more broadly, the work we do at the Institute of Transportation Studies, really we're increasingly focused on two really pressing issues. And I think they're really the issues of the day, certainly for us in transportation, but for many other sectors. You know, one is climate change, and the other is social equity, social justice. And we are really aggressively pursuing both of those in a way that we can pursue the public interest, support policy, support investments, support business decisions that really are in the public interest. And so electric vehicles is an obvious part of that. We're putting together a very strong team of researchers and postdocs and students to work on environmental justice and social justice. And so I'm very excited. You know, I've been here many years, but I'm more excited than ever by what we're doing. And certainly in the transportation world, more excited by the opportunities than ever before. And this is an amazing time in history. And I know I'm looking out the window at the red sun and the yellowing sunlight makes it feel like an alien planet here. But really, we are positioned for a much better future. And my last point I want to say is, I've spent 13 years as a board member for the California Air Resources Board. And it's really opened my eyes to the great responsibility that I was referring to before about bringing science to policy. You know, I spend a lot of time in Sacramento. I'd have to say, just anecdotally, you know, maybe 10, 20% at best of our research actually is used in decision-making in government. And that's way too low. And so that is part of, you know, my mission, our mission is to raise that, to make sure that the research we do is more useful and relevant. But it is a two-way street. So we work very closely with government, local government, state government, and federal government, as well as industry. So to make sure it is a two-way street, that they understand our capabilities, they understand our culture, and vice versa, that we understand what their needs are. So we're making great progress. And, you know, UC Davis has been, as I said at the beginning, has really been very supportive of what I've been describing. It really has been an extraordinary place. And I look forward to many more years of, you know, all of the work that we're doing to really to help guide transportation energy toward the public interest. So thank you, and I look forward. So I know there's lots of questions, and I look forward to talking with you about them.
Thank you so much, Dan. So we have, I mean, really, I just want to say before we go to questions is, you know, you really walk the walk, and you really pursue the type of research and the type of work here in the university setting that is inspiring, and it inspired me to come and work here. And I'm, you know, I'm really in your debt for being that inspirational leader of the institute, and really instilling in us this idea that research is not an ivory tower, and we have a responsibility to inform the policy policymakers and the policy space. So we do that, and I wanted to, before we turn to the questions about a lot of these topics, you know, everyone's interested in all the different tech innovations, and we can, and certainly you have expertise to get into them, but I want to continue talking about some of the why. So my first question to you is sort of looking back on your career, and let's start way back, right? What motivated you to create the Institute of Transportation Studies, and what has kept motivating you to keep growing it as you've made 10, now 12 different centers and initiatives, you know, and hundreds of people involved. So tell me a little bit more about what keeps you going.
Well, I wanted colleagues. Number one, I wanted people with similar interests. And the reality of the university is it is very disciplinary based. We have our economics department, we've got our physics department, we've got civil engineering. And there's a real need to cut across these boundaries, to bring people together, you know, from economics and management, environmental policy. And that doesn't happen naturally at any university. UC Davis is better than most in encouraging interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary initiatives and graduate programs and so on. But that's really what motivated me, is I knew that if we were going to have an impact, we had to bring people together. And so we did that with ITS, and then I did that, help get our Energy Institute started the same way, a Policy Institute as well, which, you know, Molly and I have a mutual admiration society here, because Molly has done a fabulous job where I was talking about bringing science to policy. Well, you know, most of us in doing our research, you know, we have limited time to spend with doing briefings and phone calls and policy briefs. And Molly's the one that's connected up the researchers with the policy world. And so she's done a fabulous job. And you're welcome. So that's it. You know, it's this idea of the university has to bring together people from different disciplines, different ways of thinking, different skills, because the problems we face in the world, whether it's food or health or transportation, they're complicated. And you need people that understand politics and policy and technology, engineering, economics, if we're going to have an impact.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And so I think that's absolutely true. And I think, you know, it's heartening to hear that even 10 or 12% of our research is heard at the California Air Resources Board. But how can we increase that number? What is it? How do we encourage more good research coming through the policy process? What's missing?
You know, the culture of the university doesn't really support that. You know, and that's not a criticism, because the primary role at the university is to generate new knowledge. But I think we've all come to appreciate that if we just generate the knowledge and no one uses it, that's not very good either. And so it's really creating a culture in the university. And this is not all departments, not all places, but for those that are doing more applied research. So we do want the people in the labs coming up with a new vaccine or the new, solving cancer. But we also need the people that deal like in the areas like health and food and transportation and energy. We need people that are really connected with the industry and government and NGOs out there. And so it's creating a culture. And I think if there's anything I've learned, it's how important that is. And it's, people come, partly it's self-selected. People come and work with us because they are interested in really dealing with the challenges of the real world. But it's also creating the culture in our graduate programs, in a lot of our disciplinary programs, to be thinking about how do we engage. And part of it is the reward system. So now I'm getting really into the innards of the university system, and many of you probably don't want to know about it, but many of you do know about it. And that is, continue to adapting the incentive system so that people are rewarded for doing what we do. And that is not only writing journal papers, but making sure that the research in those journal papers really is used. And that means writing policy briefs, being willing to do webinars, being willing to participate in briefings for legislators. And that's Molly's job.
Well, yes, it's inspiring actually, because I do think that a lot of the researchers at ITS are eager to come to a meeting in Sacramento or in DC, and really come and meet with the people that could make their work have really have an impact. So I think that there's an appetite within the UC Davis setting to, that may not be the case at every university, to really to have that interaction with the policymakers. So I think that, this has been informative already, and we could just, close there, and I'm sure people would have learned a lot. But let's turn to some of the really big issues at hand and really dig into them. So I think let's first talk about we looked backwards, but let's think about the status quo. We've got a crisis, a public health crisis on our hands right now. There's lots of research coming out that says pooling and shared mobility is the future. But what about now? We know that with COVID-19, shared travel is going to be affected. People are reticent to travel together, and carpooling is, of course, something of a thing of the past because people aren't commuting. So how do we reconcile this? There's short-term efforts, but what do we think can happen to shared mobility and public transit in the future?
Well, if we start with public transit, that's where it's really most egregious, really most serious. And that is, so part of that car-centric transportation system I described earlier that we've embraced so avidly has meant that we've increasingly marginalized public transportation. And so now in the United States, on average, mass transit, public transportation serves only about 2% of the trips traveled in the US. It's only 2%. And if you just think about it, how many people are low income, how many people are physically disabled, it's any metric you use, it's way more than 2%. And so, first of all, we're doing a very poor job serving all of those marginalized and disadvantaged communities and travelers. And so what's happened over time is mass transit has been in a slow decline. And now, in fact, in the last 7 or 8 years, public transit ridership in the US dropped in almost every single metropolitan area in the country. It was actually dropped in 31 out of 34, and 1 or 2 it was about the same. Seattle was the only city where public transit ridership went up, and they put a lot of effort into it. They're a good case study of what can be done. So meanwhile, along comes the pandemic, and it just fell off the table. And so there was just slight declines. And then with the pandemic, there's been 80, 90% reduction in ridership on most transit systems. It's come back a little bit. It's up to maybe only 65 or 70% reduced from where it was. And, big changes are needed in transit. And I talk to my legislative staff friends and they say transit, they're coming to Sacramento, they're asking for billions of dollars, and they say, well, first of all, we don't have it, and second of all, we're not going to give it to them unless they really transform themselves. And so that's the big challenge, I think, with public transit is how do we transform it? And I'll just, I know I've been talking a lot, so I'll just say my one solution for transit is that it needs to develop the partnerships with these private mobility services. I think really, transit could come back maybe to where it was, but if it's really going to serve an expanded part of our population, it's got to do something very different. And the only thing different I can see that is even plausible is to create the partnerships with Lyft and Uber and Via and a lot of other companies in a way that provides service in the less dense areas, in the suburban areas where transit doesn't work very well, that provides what we call first and last mile. That means the bus can operate really well in a corridor where there's a lot of people going from one area to another, but that bus or that rail is very inefficient for almost anything else. And so, but if we can have some way of accessing it, and it could be scooters, could be bike share, it could be Lyft and Uber, if we do that, then we have the potential to really create a robust public transportation system that will serve a lot more people. But that is perhaps the most pressing critical issue right now in transportation, is what to do about transit.
Absolutely. And I certainly couldn't agree more that transit agencies can do a lot to address this and could stand to innovate. I will push back and say that a wise person from the California Transit Association that we spoke with recently did remind us that transit agencies are one piece, and it will take policy that goes much further. So could you speak a little bit to this idea that the solution for transit agencies might not be up to the transit agencies themselves?
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, we've starved these transit agencies for so long that they just don't have the resources to be innovative. And, that's not a criticism. It's a reality of what's happened for almost all the transit operators, not all of them, but almost all of them. And so we've created also a system where our public finance, so we say transit is heavily subsidized. It gets about 80% of the total cost is covered from gas taxes, property taxes, sales taxes. But we do it in such a narrow way that we don't encourage the innovation. So for instance, an example of a specific example that I'd like to see happen a lot more, it's happening a little bit in pilots, is that if in a rural, let's say in a suburban area where running a big bus out there is really expensive, you're spending $40, $50 per passenger to serve these suburban areas in many, if not most cases. So why not use some of these other services to provide it, but let's do it in a way that we subsidize the low income users out there in the suburban areas. So maybe, for instance, they, instead of spending $40 per trip, we spend $3 or $4, and we do it through an app of some of these private services. But right now, it's almost impossible to do that because the way our transportation finance system is structured at the federal level, at the state level, and the local level, is it doesn't allow for these permanent revenue streams to support these. There's money they get to do a little pilot project here or there, but then money disappears. In the Sacramento area, they've done a great job with what we call micro transit, which means taking vans and operating them essentially like an Uber or a Lyft. And in that case, it's operated by the public transit, so, you know, the regional transit district of Sacramento, but it's being done in an ad hoc way. There's not a permanent funding stream. So this is one of the many revolutions, one of the many and many revolutions that are needed to create this more sustainable transportation system. And we're doing research. So part of it is we've got researchers thinking about how do you reform public finance to, and not necessarily to increase it, but to reform it.
Right, exactly. And it is about finding ways to fund the system that will make for a more robust transit network. And certainly pricing has been an incentive that we've talked about a lot in the research. I think you mentioned Uber and Lyft, and I think that, you know, another thorny question, and I'm trying to throw you some hardballs here, so, you know, so people can really understand, you know, what some of these complex issues. We know that Uber and Lyft are on the ballot in November. Prop 22 will determine whether their employees should be independent contractors. And some have said it might be, you know, an existential threat to the ride-hailing operators, that if they have to create an employment workforce. We don't want to get into the details of this fight specifically, but can you speak to how this relates to the bigger picture for ride-hailing and for automation? Because we know that automation plays a role in the future for ride-hailing labor.
Yeah, this is a really tough one, especially if you think about it, the ballot vote in California. You know, on the one hand, you know, speaking more broadly about our society is, you know, we really have allowed these inequities to grow in our society, where there's a large number of people that, you know, are not seeing their incomes increase, have been in many ways disenfranchised from many of the benefits of our growing economy. And this idea that we have all these gig workers, here we are in California, who often are not employees, but are contractors. And what do we do about that? You know, actually, so I'm not expert in labor law, but I will make one, pass on one thought, and that is we've created kind of a distinct labor system where either you're an employee or not. And I think that has to change. And I know that, you know, to Uber and Lyft's benefit, they are looking at how can they create this in-between state where they guarantee minimum wages and health benefits without the drivers being employees. But because in the larger picture, we need, if we're going to create a transportation system where it's demand responsive, which is what Lyft and Uber are, you've got to create, you know, a flexible system. And if all these drivers are just employees, we're back to taxis, and taxis are expensive and provide poor service. And so somehow there's a middle ground in there that we need to seek, because Uber and Lyft and the companies like it, Via and some others, I really think they are the first step. They're the foot in the door towards a sustainable future. And when we get to automation, those automated cars, they better be operated by mobility companies and not by individuals. If they're owned by individuals, then, I mean, just think about it, you know, yourselves and myself. And I was just on a call helping the Tahoe region figure out their transportation solutions this morning. And I just think about it, they'll be commuting from Tahoe, because if you're in an automated car, you can work, you can sleep, you can eat. What do you care if it's a 2 or 3 hour ride? And so you know, just by definition, and all of our research supports this, is if we have automated cars owned mostly by individuals, it will be perhaps not a disaster, but it will really set us back in terms of all of these public goals that we want. And so Uber and Lyft, they are, you know, maybe they're not the ones that are going to survive to be the operators of these automated vehicles. You know, GM wants to be an operator. Google wants to be the operator through its Waymo. So who knows how it's going to play out? But this business model, this construct, really is the key to the future. And somehow we need to figure out, you know, how to make these companies viable.
Great answer. Yeah, and I think that there's this very complex and interesting that both Uber and Lyft have now made a commitment to combating climate change. Through their recent announcement that Uber would electrify their fleet by 2040, and Lyft has said that they would electrify their fleet by 2030. I know that there's also a lot of studies. Let's turn now to the broader issues around climate change and what ITS and researchers at UC Davis are doing to address carbon in the transportation sector. So I know there's a research project on evaluating the plausibility of how you would get to zero net carbon by 2045. So can you speak a little bit to that UC Davis, UC ITS effort?
Okay, here's another politically sensitive issue, but one that I think we've gotten very good at addressing these. Part of it requires us as researchers to appreciate the political setting so that we don't do anything completely stupid politically and therefore get ignored and in terms of our partnership. So what we're doing is we are leading 3 other UC campuses. There's 4 of us, and UC Davis, ITS Davis is the lead. We have been asked to do an analysis of how can the state get to zero carbon transportation by 2045. Now that is the goal of the state of California. There's a law that says 40% reduced by 2030, and there's a governor's executive order for 100% reduction in net zero carbon by 2045. And so we're doing the analysis for the state of California, for the legislature, for Cal EPA on how do we get there. And we're supposed to come up with recommendations on how we get there. And that report is due out in end of October. And so we got this big team of people, across the UC system working with us. And I think this is a good example of how we help. And so we've gotten to the point where they trust us now, that the legislature and the agencies are now saying they're waiting for our results as they start making decisions about investing new dollars in greenhouse gas reduction and in electric vehicles and chargers and everything else that's needed to decarbonize. So we are having a big impact, and certainly with Sacramento, and depending on what happens in Washington, not to get political, but if there's a new administration that is very interested in climate change, we will be we're already well connected there with the Senate and the House. They put out these climate studies, blueprints. And in the House one, ITS Davis was specifically called out. We were the only university in the country that was called out in terms of our research and how it was influencing the decisions that they were making or the plans that they were making. So this is a big part of what we're up to here. And thanks for the question.
Sure, yeah, and it's so great that the House Select Committee on Climate mentioned 3 revolutions specifically, and it really is it speaks highly to your work in that space.
I want to make one comment on that is, those of us in academia, we don't get to brand anything in our lives, in our careers. And this is the best I've done is come up with this brand, the 3 revolutions. And it really is widely used in industry and government as a way of thinking about, it's a construct, it's a narrative. And for us, it's a brand. And so, I'm very pleased with that and proud.
Yeah. And Okay, so I think we have a lot of really great questions on electrification. So I think it would, it's very difficult to pick from amongst these great questions, but I think let's speak quite broadly about how we see electric vehicles playing into this, into carbon neutrality by 2045, or just where do you see, what do we need to know about electric vehicles?
The most important strategy by far in terms of decarbonized transportation is electrification. And that means electric cars, electric buses, electric trucks. And in fact, I would say for the whole climate strategy, the top two strategies, everything included, probably the number one would be convert electricity to renewable energy, and number two would be electric vehicles. And so that is front and center. And I would note that, with my other hat on, my California Air Resources Board hat on, we did, last year, we adopted a regulation requiring that all urban buses become electric, that all sales of buses must be electric by 2029. And we required just a month ago, we adopted a regulation requiring trucks, all trucks, to go electric. And I looked up the numbers because it's so stunning that I thought to give the exact numbers is important. Starting in 2024, 9% of the major group of trucks sold must be electric. 9% in 2024, going up to 75% in 2035. And it's a little lower for tractor trailers, those big long haul trucks. And it's a little lower for the big pickup trucks, which are considered part of trucking. But this is extraordinary. And so California really is a leader, and the rest of the world is watching what we do in electrification. And so that's where my two lives come together, is my CARB board position and university, because I understand what the needs are, the research needs. And so our institute does a tremendous amount of work supporting what California is doing to electrify cars, buses, and trucks.
Great. Yeah, absolutely. So we've got 10 minutes left, and I want to hit a couple other topics. So we're going to go some short questions. So do you think that I'm going to turn quickly to aviation, and this is not directly related to climate, but of course aviation does have a massive effect on climate. So do you think there's a role for electric aviation, short distance helicopter services, or even vertical takeoff and landing? There was a number of questions that came from the audience on this topic. It's a hot button topic. So yay or nay on these topics?
I think, yes, there's a role. I was surprised, about a year or two ago, I was asked to speak at a conference on electric aviation, and I had kind of put it off, and I said, okay, sure. It seemed so marginal, but sure, let me go. And it was all of these engineers and companies that were investing billions of dollars that I hadn't appreciated in electric aviation. There's massive investment going into it. And so the problem with it is that the batteries are still heavy and dense, and you really can't, you're not going to take a 747 or 787 jetliner and make it electric or with batteries. The amount of batteries would be it would take up the whole plane, basically. But there is an opportunity for short haul. And what does short haul mean? It used to mean 100 miles, but now with improvements in batteries, we're starting to talk about maybe 300, maybe even 400-mile ranges for these planes. But I do have a concern about the really short haul ones, whether they're electric or not. And that is, it's kind of the optics of it. Like, who's going to use it? These are going to be more expensive. So I just think about it, in this day and age of we're thinking about social justice, and we're going to be down on the ground here, and these rich people are going to be flying over us in these little planes. So there's a real optics issue that has to be addressed. But I think, yes, there is a real opportunity, and there is short haul planes, and I think in our metropolitan areas, there is a role to play. But I don't think it's going to be a really big role for a number of reasons.
Yes, absolutely. It's just interesting. I think, it's no longer pie in the sky, no pun intended, but it's still a little bit of a ways off that it would be affordable for mass production, mass use.
I would,
So,
I would note, so Molly, I would note with that actually the key to it is probably if they're automated, and that's where
right.
that's where a lot of the money is going also, is to make, because if these small planes, if they have a pilot, it makes it very expensive. But if the small planes don't have a pilot, then you can start providing these services at a relatively low cost. And so there are a lot of, experts and engineers and others saying that it should be pretty safe because you've got 3 dimensions to work with as opposed on the ground where it's 2 dimensions. So easier to avoid a collision, I guess, is what they're saying. We'll see.
Yes. Well, maybe this is where the 3 revolutions will happen. Maybe we'll all be surprised that that it happens in the sky as well as on land. But we'll see. I'm not going to rule it out, but I'm a little skeptical. But so we have just a couple minutes left. So I wanted to do a final question. And the final question I think I'm going to ask you is what are you most hopeful about related to the 3 revolutions? And that will close us out.
What what I'm most hopeful for is electrification, but what I'm most hoping for, electrification is going to happen. There's absolutely zero doubt anymore. Every automotive company has made a massive investment in electric vehicles. The big truck companies are starting to do that now. The policies are being put in place, not just here in California, but around the world. It's happening. It's really just a question of how fast it's going to happen. But the part that I hope for is the sharing part, the sharing of rides. And I know that's more challenging, but really in terms, the 2 keys to a sustainable transportation system is the sharing of rides and the electrification. So I'm very confident about electrification. I'm a little nervous about the sharing part. We did learn in kindergarten to share, but somehow that lesson didn't stick with most of us. And now this pandemic is frightening a lot of people to make it even more challenging.
Yeah, and I know it said it was our last question, but I'm going to sneak one last one in there. But speak again to this. I think let's bring the point around equity as well. What can we be hopeful about the equitable impact of the 3 revolutions, and what it stands to do for disadvantaged communities?
It's really, I think it really comes down to this pooling and sharing, because I just don't see our political system putting up the kind of resources that are needed to expand our public transportation system. We already, we're just not going to do it, I don't think, in any kind of major way. And so the real key has to be bringing the cost down, and being able to subsidize those services that do serve lower income and disadvantaged people. So the pooling part of it, and so my one last kind of policy wonk idea is that we can start right now by using incentives and disincentives for not just the ride hailing companies, but even for our own cars. We can do things like at airports. If you arrive in a single occupant vehicle, in a vehicle by yourself, then you really pay a stiff fee. If you arrive in a group, in a pool, super shuttle, bus, then not only do you have less of a fee put on it, but you can stop right at the terminal, So all the things we're talking about don't have to be money. There's a lot of things we can do, incentives and disincentives, that are non-monetary. And that would be just a little illustration of that. Thanks for
Ab-
giving me the opportunity to say that.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for all these this thoughtful discussion. It really a pleasure as always. I guess we'll close there, and I'd like to thank you, Director Sperling, for that great presentation and for joining us today, and all of you for asking such great questions. I tried to integrate a lot of the questions into sort of combined questions, but obviously we weren't going to address all of them. So we'll do our best to provide resources that can address some of the questions asked, and we can directly respond to others. And so with that, I'd like to also thank you for we cannot tackle this complex and complicated work without your philanthropic support. Your support is essential for assuring that UC Davis can continue to pursue innovations and inform policy and that stands to positively influence the environment and the way we live. So with this in mind, please consider making a gift to ITS so we can continue this great work, or give to another great area at UC Davis. There's so many people that are equally as passionate, and we really want to bring to that passion. So if you're interested, please feel free to contact Dr. Sperling or Karen Block, and they would be happy to assist you. And their contact information is going to be put here on the screen. And before we go, I also wanted to tell you about one more upcoming event that we hope you will attend. Excuse me, 2 events. I'm going to take the opportunity to first plug an event that we have on Thursday, September 24th at 10:30. It's a webinar on the public health dimensions of the 3 revolutions. We touched on it a little bit today, but if you go to 3rev.ucdavis.edu and go to events, you'll find information on that on September 24th webinar. And then the next event is also a virtual event happening here at UC Davis on October 10th at 4 p.m. Pacific time. There will be an event called the Innovation Spectacular. And I've heard it's going to be exciting, inspiring, and a feel-good event. So, I'm sure we all could use that right now. So please hold 4 p.m. On October 10th on your calendars. An email with more information about that event will be sent to you soon, as well as some more resources to address the questions we were unable to answer today. So on behalf of the university, thank you again for joining us today. We hope you're staying healthy and safe, and we look forward to connecting with you again soon. So goodbye. Thank you so much. We'll sign off there.